As Mrs. Sovak droned on about the history of American labor at the front of the classroom, Clark watched Paul's futile attempts to take notes left-handed. The poor guy's entire right side was out of commission. His right arm was in an elaborate sling designed to help heal his dislocated shoulder and partially torn labrum. Clark replayed the scene in his head for the 100th time, how he'd collided with Paul at full speed, how they'd skidded across the wet pavement and into the tire of a parked van. For the past week, he'd been trying to decide if there was a way he could have saved his ex-teammate without injury, but each time he thought about it, he came to the same conclusion. The violent tackle was unavoidable. Wasn't it? The football team didn't see it that way. Kyle and Tommy hadn't spotted the SUV until it crashed into a retaining wall built to protect the new Mankins headquarters construction zone. And Clark hit Paul with such force that they had ended up clear on the other side of the street. So the other players didn't understand how Paul could have been in any real danger in the first place. Especially when the police believed the Mankins construction site had been the man in Brown's intended target. Not that they could have asked the man himself. He was in a coma, and doctors didn't expect him to survive. Now some guys on the football team thought Clark had blasted Paul on purpose, out of jealousy. And maybe they were right. Not about the jealousy part, but it was possible the SUV wasn't going to run over Paul. Maybe Clark had miscalculated. Felt like every time he tried to help, someone got hurt. And he came out looking like the bad guy. As if the universe were trying to mock him, Clark now heard the faint crying sound of someone else who might need help. It was coming from a girl, he was pretty sure, but none of the female faces around him seemed the least bit upset. Bored to tears, maybe, but not upset. Mary Baker was smacking gum and covertly texting beneath her desk. Olivia Goodman was biting her fingernails while staring longingly out the classroom window. Sherry Miller was sketching some kind of dark unicorn scene in the margins of her poli-sci textbook. "Clark," Lana Lang whispered beside him. The crying sound reminded Clark of Paul's quiet whimpering as the four of them watched a rescue crew use the jaws of life to free the man from the mangled SUV. Not only was Paul's shoulder in bad shape, but the skin on his arm and the side of his face had been badly scraped up when he and Clark slid across the wet pavement. Clark, of course, didn't have a scratch. Even his glasses, which had fallen off in the collision, had come out unscathed. "Earth to Clark Kent," Lana whispered more forcefully. "Dude, what's your deal?" This time he turned to look at his best friend. She was wearing the oval moonstone necklace her mom had given her on her 16th birthday and a t-shirt that read, "The future is female." Her red hair was pulled back into a ponytail, like it always was at school, and the closest thing to makeup she had on was lip balm. "Who, me?" Clark mouthed to her. "You're like all over the place today," she whispered. More crying. He wondered if Lana could hear it too, or maybe it was coming from somewhere outside the classroom. Lana motioned toward Paul. "He's going to be fine," she whispered. "If it wasn't for you, he wouldn't even be here." Clark shrugged and turned back to their teacher, trying to focus on Mrs. Sovak's marathon lecture. She was breaking down the evolution of migratory work in America. "Agricultural migrant work started as far back as the 1600s, she explained. "These were the indentured servants coming from England. Of course, we can never forget the monstrosities of slavery, when African people were brought to this country against their will. And in the 1840s, tens of thousands of Mexican workers began coming across the border to take labor jobs. This particular group, as I mentioned earlier, will be the focus of our final unit." It wasn't that Clark was uninterested. His problem was that he couldn't stop staring at Paul's sling, replaying the incident downtown, thinking about the man with the knife. And now he was also fixated on the subtle crying he kept hearing. Mrs. Sovak stopped and eyed the class. "I'm not telling you all this for my health, you know. It'll be on our final." Clark sat up straight as her gaze briefly fell upon him. "I'm sure you're aware of the protests downtown," she went on. "This stuff is as relevant as ever. How we choose to address the situation today will significantly impact the future of your town and family farms." Clark tried to isolate on the crying sound, but everything else was getting in the way. Jessica Napier was whispering to a friend in the back of the class. "Tommy's party next weekend is going to be huge. Everyone's going to be there." Out in the hallway, a student walked by with headphones, listening to an old country song Clark vaguely recognized. Clear across campus, Kyle made a joke about bulldozing right over Willie Moore during yesterday's spring scrimmage. One of Kyle's cronies snickered loudly, and then a locker slammed shut. Clark could even hear a small plane somewhere in the sky, a single-engine prop plane to be exact. He could tell by the whipping sound of the front propeller. The plane was flying somewhere over a neighboring community. Like Noonan, maybe. No, that was impossible. Noonan was the nearest town, but it was still more than 30 miles away. Great, now his mind was playing tricks on him. He rubbed his ears with the heels of his hands and stared at Mrs. Sovak. It wasn't just his hearing ability that was changing. All his powers seemed to be getting stronger. 2 days ago, he'd seen right through a wall into the classroom next door. He'd watched a freshman girl pass a note to another girl who laughed without sound. These new abilities both thrilled him and scared him to death. But it was his hearing that he was focused on now. Somewhere on campus, a girl was crying. Her soft sobs sounded so broken and desperate that they eventually drowned out everything else in Clark's head. He needed to find out who she was and why she was so sad.